3rd of October 1986. Sargasso Sea, Patrol Box November. Soviet submarine K-219, Project 667A Yankee Y, maintains station with 16 R-27 liquid fuel ballistic missiles and 2 VM-4 pressurized water reactors. The watch log shows missile compartment atmosphere normal, propulsion steady on twin cores. At 0514, a tube integrity alarm sounds. Silo 6. Operators expect a minor seal seep, manageable by procedure. The perimeter monitor shows nitrogen tetroxide vapor concentrations climbing. Within minutes, hypergolic fuel and oxidizer meet seawater in the confined space. The reaction is immediate. Explosion, fire, 3 men dead. Control wiring damaged. Background radiation remains normal. The first numbers that matter are chemical, not radiological. But the explosion has severed remote reactor control circuits. Without reliable scram capability, the next step must be manual. They do not yet know this casualty will write doctrine, claim 4 lives, and place 2 nuclear cores on the abyssal plane forever. 1st and 2nd of October, 1986. North Atlantic Patrol Box, approximately 600 miles northeast of Bermuda. Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-219, hull number from Project 667A, cruises submerged on deterrent patrol. The submarine carries 16 R-27U missiles, NATO designation SSN-6 Serb, each fueled with unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide, liquid storable propellants that ignite on contact. 2 VM-4 pressurized water reactors, each generating 70 megawatts thermal, drive twin screws through reduction gearing. The watchlog notes stable plant parameters, normal atmosphere readings in all compartments, routine communications traffic with Northern Fleet Headquarters. Captain 2nd Rank Igor Britanov commands. His crew numbers 119 officers, warrant officers and seamen. They are trained for reactor casualties, flooding, fire and collision. But the design expectation is that sealed missile tubes and procedural rigor will keep hypergolic chemistry contained. The R-27 series was chosen for early Soviet sea-based deterrence because liquid propellants offered higher specific impulse than early solid motors, enabling longer range from smaller hull volumes. The trade-off: stored energy in the form of reactive chemicals, separated from seawater by steel tube walls, elastomer seals, and procedural vigilance. The National Security Archive summary, compiled from Soviet and American sources, describes K-219's armament: 16 missiles, 32 warheads, reactors operating within normal parameters at the start of the patrol. The 667A class, introduced in the late 1960s, represented the first generation of Soviet strategic submarines capable of sustained patrols within range of continental targets. By October of 1986, many Yankee-class boats had aged past their nominal service lives, but operational tempo kept them rotating through patrol boxes while newer classes entered service. The missile compartment lies amidships, a pressure hull within a hull, divided into 16 vertical launch tubes. Each tube is monitored for pressure, temperature, and atmosphere composition. If seawater intrudes through a failed seal, it meets nitrogen tetroxide first, an oxidizer so reactive that organic contamination can trigger decomposition, heat, and toxic gas generation even before fuel is involved. Procedures call for immediate tube isolation, atmosphere sampling, and damage assessment. The design assumes early detection, and procedural response will contain any seal degradation before criticality, chemical or nuclear, is approached. On the night of the 2nd, all compartments report normal. The contrast between that routine and the next morning's casualty will define everything that follows. 3rd of October, 1986, 05 hours local. Sargasso Sea, depth 150 meters. The alarm sounds as a steady electronic tone in the missile compartment, accompanied by the red backlight on Tube 6's integrity tile. The watch officer logs the event and alerts the command post. Initial expectations: a slow seal seep, perhaps elastomer degradation from years of pressure cycling and salt exposure, manageable through procedural isolation and atmosphere monitoring. Missile technicians don breathing apparatus and approach the tube's lower access hatch to verify readings. What they find contradicts the training scenario. Tube 6 is flooding from below, seawater has entered through a failed seal assembly, and the nitrogen tetroxide oxidizer, normally isolated in the missile's upper stage, is venting into the tube space. Nitrogen tetroxide reacts with water to form nitric acid and nitrogen dioxide, a brown-orange toxic gas. Simultaneously, unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine fuel, stored in a separate tank, begins mixing with the oxidizer in the flooded tube. The two hypergolic propellants ignite on contact, no spark required. At 0532, the explosion occurs. The pressure wave propagates through the missile compartment, rupturing ventilation ducting and severing electrical cables. 3 enlisted men, missile technicians responding to the initial alarm, are killed instantly by blast overpressure and thermal effects. The fire spreads to cable insulation and auxiliary equipment, filling the compartment with nitrogen dioxide and combustion products. Survivors seal the forward and aft hatches, isolating the missile bay from adjacent spaces. Portable gas detectors register nitrogen dioxide concentrations in the hundreds of parts per million, immediately dangerous to life. The National Security Archive brief, drawing on Politburo minutes and US Navy intelligence summaries, confirms the sequence. Explosion in one of its missile tubes due to leakage of missile fuel into the tube on October 3. The explosion itself is a chemical event, not radiological, no fission products, no criticality, no prompt neutron flux. But the blast has damaged electrical distribution panels and control wiring that serve the reactor compartment aft. Remote reactor scram circuits, designed to insert control rods automatically on loss of power or manual command, cannot be verified as functional. Instrumentation to the control room shows erratic readings. Some channels are dead. Captain Britanov orders an emergency surface. Compressed air blows ballast tanks, and K-219 broaches in moderate seas under battery power, her main propulsion plant still operating, but her command and control systems compromised. The immediate threat is toxic atmosphere and structural damage. The secondary threat, emerging as electrical diagnostics continue, is loss of assured reactor shutdown capability. If the reactors cannot be reliably tripped from the control room, the next option is manual insertion of control rods from within the reactor compartment itself, a procedure never performed under combat damage conditions aboard an operational Soviet ballistic missile submarine. The decision point is approaching. 3rd of October, 1986, late morning. K-219 wallows on the surface, her bow riding the swells while brown-orange nitrogen dioxide vapor vents from the missile compartment through jury-rigged exhaust paths. In the control room, engineering officers attempt to verify reactor status through degraded instrumentation. Neutron flux readings suggest both reactors remain critical at low power, providing steam for electrical generators and propulsion. The damage assessment is incomplete, but one fact is clear: remote scram cannot be confirmed. If a reactivity excursion occurs from loss of cooling, void formation, or geometry change due to progressive flooding, there may be insufficient time or capability to insert rods from the control room. The manual shutdown procedure exists in doctrine, but its execution requires personnel to enter the reactor compartment, navigate to the control rod drive mechanisms, and physically turn handwheels to drive rods into the core by mechanical force. Each reactor has multiple rod groups. Full shutdown requires sequential insertion until neutron multiplication ceases. The compartment will be hot, both from reactor decay heat and from steam leaks or fire damage. Atmospheric conditions are uncertain. Time is limited. Senior Seaman Sergei Preminin, a reactor section enlisted specialist, volunteers. He is 20 years old, trained in reactor operations, and familiar with the manual drive systems from drills conducted in port. He enters the reactor compartment with another technician. Their task? Locate the manual control wheels, verify mechanical engagement, and insert all rod groups to achieve subcritical configuration. The procedure is stepwise, one group at a time, confirming position indicators if available, or counting handwheel rotations if instrumentation is lost. Inside the compartment, temperatures exceed normal operating conditions. Steam obscures sight lines. The 2 men locate the first handwheel and begin turning. Each revolution drives the rods incrementally deeper. Neutron flux begins to drop. The effect is measurable in the control room. The first reactor achieves shutdown, the second requires similar work. Preminin continues, moving from handwheel to handwheel, inserting rod groups in sequence. The other technician exits briefly to report progress and to escape rising heat. The National Security Archive summary, drawing on Russian sources and subsequent investigations, confirms the outcome. Crew forced to shut down the nuclear reactors manually. Senior Seaman Sergei Preminin remained in the compartment and could not be evacuated. After completing the insertion sequence, Preminin attempts to exit the compartment through the aft hatch. A pressure differential, caused by ventilation failures and heat-induced overpressure, prevents the hatch from opening. Attempts to equalize pressure or force the hatch from the outside fail. Preminin remains sealed inside. Within hours, elevated temperatures and atmosphere contamination prove fatal. Both reactors are now subcritical, their control rods fully inserted. Fission chains halted. Decay heat will continue for days, but neutron multiplication has ceased. The criticality threat is eliminated. K-219 survival now depends on atmosphere control, buoyancy management and external assistance. But the human cost has risen. 3 dead in the missile bay explosion, 1 dead in the reactor compartment, and the submarine, damaged and barely controllable, remains on the surface in international waters, far from port. The next phase will require a towline, 3rd and 4th of October, 1986. K-219 drifts on the surface, her diesel generators silent, main propulsion offline, relying on battery reserves to maintain minimal electrical loads and slow headway. The missile compartment remains sealed, its atmosphere still toxic despite ventilation attempts. Nitrogen dioxide concentrations measured by portable detectors exceed safe entry thresholds. Any opening of the compartment risks exposing adjacent spaces to gas intrusion. Damage control parties deploy breathing apparatus and establish decontamination protocols for personnel rotating through forward spaces. The contrast is striking. Soviet submarine doctrine emphasizes radiation protection and reactor casualty response, training crews extensively on prompt criticality, loss of coolant scenarios, and containment breaches. But K-219's first 48 hours are dominated not by radiological hazards. Background levels remain normal throughout the boat, but by toxic industrial chemistry. Nitrogen dioxide causes pulmonary edema and chemical burns to respiratory tissue. Even brief exposures at high concentration can be lethal. Medical corpsmen treat inhalation injuries among crew who were in or near the missile bay during the initial venting. Structural damage complicates every response. The explosion severed electrical cables and ruptured ventilation trunks in the missile section. Portable generators provide limited power to essential systems, but normal distribution paths are compromised. Battery capacity, sufficient for emergency lighting and basic navigation, will not sustain prolonged operations. The 2 reactors, now shut down, cannot be restarted without assured cooling paths and control restoration, neither of which is available in the current condition. Watertight integrity is degraded. Flooding in the missile compartment, initially caused by the seal failure, continues through the damaged tube structure. Free surface water inside a pressure hull degrades stability. As the boat rolls, water sloshes from side to side, amplifying the roll and making trim difficult to hold. Damage control teams pump what they can reach, but access to the missile bay remains restricted by atmosphere. The submarine's buoyancy is slowly eroding. Politburo minutes, declassified and published by the National Security Archive, summarize the crew's struggle in stark language. The fight for the survival of the submarine lasted 3 days. The phrase captures both the duration and the nature of the effort. Not a single decisive action, but a sustained campaign to control flooding, manage toxic atmospheres, jury-rig electrical systems, and maintain enough headway to prevent broaching or capsizing. By the morning of the 4th, it is clear K-219 cannot return to port under her own power. The engineering plant is offline, damage is extensive, and crew endurance is declining. The solution will require external assistance, a tow vessel, a towline, and a transit of over 1,000 nautical miles to a Soviet or friendly port. Fleet headquarters in Moscow coordinates with available commercial and naval assets. The closest suitable tow vessel is the Soviet merchant ship Krasnogvardeysk, steaming to intercept. But towing a damaged ballistic missile submarine in the open Atlantic with uncertain stability and ongoing flooding, is an engineering challenge that will test every margin. The first task is to pass a line, 3rd through 5th of October, 1986. Moscow, Washington, and the North Atlantic Patrol Zone. As K-219 fights for survival on the surface, political and military channels activate in parallel. The Soviet Union, still absorbing international criticism from the Chernobyl reactor disaster 5 months earlier, faces an immediate decision: whether to acknowledge the submarine casualty publicly and notify the United States and international bodies, or to maintain operational silence as Cold War doctrine traditionally required. General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, meeting with Politburo members on the 5th of October, chooses transparency. Declassified minutes record his instruction to inform the Americans, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the Soviet press agency TASS about the incident. The decision represents a departure from prior practice. In previous submarine accidents, including the loss of K-8 in 1970 and K-219's near collision with the USS Augusta earlier in K-219's service life, Soviet authorities provided minimal public information and delayed or avoided notification to Western governments. Admiral Vladimir Chernovin, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, manages the military response. His staff coordinates with Northern Fleet operations to vector assistance toward K-219's position, while simultaneously updating the Ministry of Defense and Politburo on the submarine's status. The information passed to US counterparts is factual. A missile tube malfunction has caused an explosion and fire. Reactors have been shut down. The submarine is on the surface and requires tow assistance. No immediate radiological hazard is assessed. President Reagan's acknowledgement, documented in the Politburo memo, closes the loop. Thanked the Soviets for providing information quickly. The phrasing is diplomatic, but the substance matters. Rapid notification allows the United States to adjust its anti-submarine warfare operations in the area, reducing the risk of misidentification or miscalculation as Soviet and American naval assets converge near a stricken ballistic missile submarine carrying nuclear warheads and reactor cores. The timing is not coincidental. Gorbachev and Reagan are scheduled to meet in Reykjavik, Iceland, on the 11th and 12th of October for arms control discussions. A submarine accident, mishandled or obscured, could poison the summit atmosphere. Transparency, by contrast, demonstrates that glasnost, the policy of openness, applies even to sensitive military incidents. The K-219 notification becomes a proof of concept for crisis communication in a superpower relationship still defined by mutual suspicion. But transparency does not alter physics. While diplomats draft press lines and naval staffs deconflict assets, K-219 continues to take on water. Stability margins narrow. The tow vessel Krasnogvardeysk is closing, but every hour increases fatigue on the crew and stress on the damaged hull. The diplomatic optics may be favorable, but the hydrodynamics are unforgiving. Overnight, the situation will worsen. 5th of October, 1986. Sargasso Sea, approximately 600 miles east-northeast of Bermuda. The Soviet merchant vessel Krasnogvardeysk arrives on scene after a high-speed transit and begins the delicate process of establishing a tow connection to K-219. The submarine, still on the surface but barely controllable, presents a challenging target. Her bow rides low, her stern higher due to progressive flooding in the missile compartment. Free surface water inside the pressure hull causes erratic trim changes as the boat rolls in moderate seas. A heaving line is passed first, a lightweight messenger that allows the tow crew aboard Krasnogvardeysk to pull the heavy towing bridle across the gap between the vessels. The bridle, a multi-part steel cable assembly, is secured to K-219's forward towing cleats, fittings designed into the hull structure for just this contingency. Tension is taken up slowly. The tow begins at low speed to avoid shock loading. Captain Britanov remains aboard K-219 with a skeleton crew to manage flooding, monitor trim and coordinate with the tow vessel by radio. The plan is to nurse the damaged submarine home, a transit of over 1,000 nautical miles to the nearest Soviet or friendly port. Estimated time: several days at towing speed, assuming the towline holds and stability can be maintained. But the physics work against them. A surfaced submarine under tow is not a stable platform. The long, narrow hull lacks the freeboard and reserve buoyancy of a surface ship. Any flooding increases draft and reduces the margin between positive buoyancy and sinking, and K-219 is already compromised. The missile compartment is flooded, structural bulkheads are damaged, and pumping capacity is limited by the loss of main electrical generation. The National Security Archive summary notes that Krasnogvardeysk established tow, and for a time salvage appeared possible. That phrase, "for a time," captures the narrow window of hope. As the tow proceeds through the afternoon and evening of the 5th, damage control teams aboard K-219 struggle to manage rising water levels. The missile bay, sealed from the rest of the boat, cannot be dewatered without opening hatches and venting toxic atmosphere, a trade-off that would expose adjacent compartments. External flooding, through the damaged tube structure or through other openings created by the explosion, continues unchecked. Towing introduces new stresses. The towline, even at modest speeds, exerts hundreds of tons of force on the forward hull fittings. Each wave cycle jerks the cable taut, then slackens it, then tautens again. Fatigue accumulates in the bridle, the cleats, and the damaged hull structure. The submarine's stability, already marginal, is further degraded by variable trim and heel angles, induced by towing forces and sea state. Soviet naval staff, monitoring the situation from Moscow and from command ships in the Atlantic, calculate the odds. Each hour under tow increases the cumulative strain. Each hour also brings the submarine closer to port. The question is whether the margin shrinks faster than the distance. Overnight, on the 6th of October, the margin collapses. The tow cable parts, 5th and 6th of October, 1986. Moscow press rooms, Washington briefing spaces, and naval staff headquarters on both sides. As K-219 drifts under tow, a parallel struggle unfolds over the narrative of what caused the casualty. Early Soviet draft communiques, prepared before technical investigations could be completed, float the possibility of a collision, perhaps with the USSE. Augusta, an American Los Angeles-class attack submarine that had shadowed K-219 earlier in the patrol. The collision hypothesis offers a convenient external cause, deflecting questions about material condition, maintenance practices, or design vulnerabilities in an aging missile system. But technical officers push back. Forensic evidence, gathered from crew testimony, instrument logs, and damage patterns observed aboard K-219, points unambiguously to an internal missile tube failure. The explosion initiated inside Tube 6, where seawater intrusion through a failed seal allowed hypergolic fuel and oxidizer to mix. No impact damage to the outer hull is observed. No acoustic signature of a collision is recorded. The explosion occurred in a sealed compartment, not at the hull-water boundary. Admiral Chernovin and Captain Britanoff, both interviewed in subsequent years, affirm the technical conclusion. Missile tube malfunction, no collision. An article in Undersea Warfare magazine, published by the Naval Submarine League, quotes Lieutenant Commander Wayne Grasdock, a U.S. Navy submarine officer, confirming the assessment. The incident was a malfunction in a missile tube, not a collision with Augusta. The BBC, interviewing Britanoff and former executive officer Igor Kurdin years later, reiterates the finding. The collision story recedes, but not before it circulates through press reports and intelligence summaries. The pattern is familiar. In the absence of complete information, initial narratives fill the void, shaped by institutional concerns, political pressures, and incomplete data. Only later, as forensic analysis converges and participants speak, does the technical truth solidify. The missile tube malfunction narrative has implications. It shifts focus from operational procedure, proximity to Western submarines, rules of engagement, to design and material condition. The R-27 liquid fuel missile system, now 30 years into its service life, is revealed as a source of catastrophic risk when seal integrity fails. The incident becomes a case study not in Cold War brinksmanship, but in the hazards of storable liquid propellants aboard aging platforms. For public trust and policy, the distinction matters. A collision implies a confrontation, raising questions about submarine warfare protocols and crisis escalation. A tube malfunction implies an engineering failure, raising questions about design margins, maintenance cycles, and the safety of liquid fuel strategic missiles at sea. The Soviet Navy, and later the Russian Federation Navy, will draw lessons from K-219 that lead to accelerated replacement of liquid fuel systems with solid fuel missiles in newer submarine classes. But in the immediate moment, night of the 6th of October, forensics and narratives are secondary. K-219, her towline parted, is sinking. 6th of October, 1986, Washington briefing rooms and Moscow ministerial offices. As K-219's situation deteriorates, press inquiries escalate. Reporters recall Chernobyl, radioactive plumes, evacuations, contamination spreading across borders, and ask whether a sinking nuclear submarine poses similar risks. The questions are predictable. Could the reactors explode? Could warheads detonate? Could radioactive material contaminate Atlantic fisheries or reach coastal populations? Vice Admiral Powell Carter, U.S. Navy Director of Naval Intelligence, provides the American government's official assessment to the press. There is no danger of explosion or contamination. The statement is carefully constructed. Carter distinguishes between reactor physics and public fear. A nuclear reactor, unlike a bomb, cannot explode in a nuclear detonation. Even if the reactor vessel were to rupture, the result would be a steam explosion or containment breach, not a fission weapon yield. And K-219's reactors are shut down, control rods fully inserted, fission chains terminated. Decay heat will continue, but neutron multiplication has ceased. Similarly, nuclear warheads aboard strategic missiles cannot detonate accidentally. Their fusing and arming systems require precise sequences of mechanical, electrical, and pyrotechnic events that cannot occur through environmental stress, water immersion, or impact. Warhead cores may eventually corrode and release material, but detonation is not a credible scenario. Contamination, however, is a different question. Politburo minutes, declassified years later, show Soviet experts acknowledging that contamination at great depth in the area of the sinking would not reach the surface. The phrasing reveals the Soviet Navy's internal assessment. Material release is possible, even probable over time, as reactor primary circuits and warhead casings corrode under deep ocean conditions. But the depth, 18,000 feet, confirmed in US press reports, and the oceanographic setting favor dilution and containment. Any radionuclides released from corroding cores or warheads will disperse in cold, deep water, undergoing radioactive decay and dilution long before reaching concentrations that pose surface water or biota hazards. The physics supports the official positions on both sides. A shutdown reactor at abyssal depth does not create the surface radiological signature of a surface explosion or shallow water release. Fission product decay reduces activity by orders of magnitude in the first weeks and months. Ocean mixing further dilutes concentrations. Monitoring programs already in place for tracking atmospheric nuclear tests and prior submarine losses continue routine sampling of Atlantic seawater and fish stocks. No anomalies attributable to K-219 will appear in open literature in subsequent years, but the official assurances, while technically sound, do not address the immediate human crisis. 4 men are dead. The rest of K-219's crew is still aboard or recently evacuated, and the submarine, with 2 reactor cores and 32 warheads, is no longer held by the towline. The next report will confirm what the crew already knows. K-219 is going down. Early morning, 6th of October, 1986. Sargasso Sea, darkness over moderate swells. Aboard the tow vessel Krasnogvardesk, a sharp alarm signals towline failure. The cable, under sustained tension and cyclical loading for hours, has parted. The free end whips back toward the stern, and the tension indicators drop to 0. On the bridge, the watch immediately alerts Captain Britanov aboard K-219 by radio. The submarine, no longer under tow, is drifting freely in the current. Aboard K-219, the loss of tow eliminates the last external source of propulsion. Battery reserves are depleted, main propulsion is offline, and maneuvering capability is minimal. Flooding in the missile compartment, unchecked for 2 days, has increased the submarine's draft to the point where positive buoyancy is marginal. Damage control teams attempt to restore some pumping capacity and to seal additional leaks, but access is limited and equipment is failing. Trim becomes increasingly difficult to hold. Captain Britanov, monitoring buoyancy calculations and stability indicators, recognizes the trajectory. The submarine cannot maintain surface position without active trim control and pumping. Each hour sees more water entering the hull, more weight low in the boat, and less freeboard. The margin between floating and sinking is measured in tons of buoyancy, and that margin is eroding in real time. The National Security Archive summary, drawing on Russian and American sources, confirms the sequence: tow cord broke, submarine sank. The phrasing is terse, but the implication is clear. Once the towline parted, the outcome was determined. Some sources report that preparations were made to scuttle the submarine by opening valves, but the record is ambiguous. Britanoff himself, in later interviews, states he remained aboard until its final moments, suggesting he did not order a deliberate scuttling, but rather attempted to save the boat until physics made further effort futile. By mid-morning of the 6th, buoyancy is lost. K-219 settles deeper in the water, her bow dipping, her stern rising as flooding shifts the center of gravity forward. The order to abandon ship is passed. Crew members transfer to Krasnogvardeysk by small boat and life raft. Britanoff is the last to leave, stepping off the canting deck as the submarine begins her final descent. The sinking is not sudden, no catastrophic implosion or explosive breakup. K-219 slips beneath the surface gradually, her hull intact, disappearing into the deep water of the Hatteras abyssal plain. Within minutes, she is gone from sight. Within hours, she has passed through the thermocline, through the light penetration zone, through the mesopelagic, and into the abyssal zone where pressure exceeds 400 atmospheres and temperature hovers near freezing. Depth becomes the containment system. No recovery is possible at 18,000 feet, not in 1986, not with available technology, not in international waters during a Cold War standoff. The submarine, her 2 reactor cores, and her 16 missiles with 32 warheads will remain on the seafloor indefinitely. The final human toll, 4 dead. The final disposition, the abyss. 6th of October, 1986, and the days immediately following. K-219's final position, approximately 600 miles east-northeast of Bermuda. Hatteras abyssal plain, depth 18,000 feet. The Washington Post publishes the location and depth on the 6th, citing U.S. Navy sources. The depth is significant, deeper than most of the Atlantic basin, beyond the reach of manned submersibles available in the mid-1980s, and sufficient to ensure that hydrostatic pressure will compress the hull beyond survivable limits within minutes of descent. At 18,000 feet, ambient pressure is approximately 540 atmospheres, or nearly 8,000 pounds per square inch. The submarine's pressure hull, designed for operational depths of several hundred meters, cannot withstand this load. But the collapse depth is not reached during descent. K-219 is already flooded internally through the damaged missile compartment, so the hull pressure equalizes gradually rather than imploding catastrophically. The wreck settles upright, or nearly so, a steel cylinder resting on abyssal sediment. Temperature at this depth is near 2 degrees Celsius, cold enough to slow most chemical reactions, but not to prevent corrosion entirely. Seawater, even at depth, contains dissolved oxygen and salts that attack steel, aluminum, and other structural metals. Reactor primary circuits, constructed of stainless steel and nickel alloys, will corrode over years to decades. Warhead casings, typically stainless or exotic alloys, will follow a similar trajectory. The question is not whether material will be released, but when and at what rate. U.S. Department of Defense photographs, taken from reconnaissance aircraft on the 7th of October and released to the press, show K-219 on the surface shortly before sinking. The images reveal damage to the sail and forward superstructure, consistent with explosion and fire effects. Several sources, including declassified briefs, note that several missile hatches were open at the time of sinking, an observation that, if accurate, would allow seawater to flood the missile tubes directly, accelerating internal flooding and potentially providing pathways for long-term material release from warhead components. But the depth works in favor of containment. Any radionuclides released from corroding reactor cores or warhead pits will dissolve in cold, deep water and disperse according to abyssal current patterns. mixing with the vast volume of the Atlantic, combined with radioactive decay, reduces concentrations to levels far below detection, thresholds at the surface. No fishing advisories are issued. No coastal monitoring stations report anomalies. The abyss, indifferent to human design or political borders, becomes the long-term repository for 2 nuclear cores and 32 weapons. Late 1986 through 1987. Moscow, Northern Fleet Headquarters, and the closed administrative system that governs Soviet submarine operations. In the immediate aftermath of K-219's loss, institutional response splits along predictable lines. Assign accountability, recognize heroism, and extract lessons for doctrine and design. Captain Igor Britanov faces formal charges. The loss of a ballistic missile submarine on patrol, with fatalities and international attention, demands a legal accounting.